Good evening. Wherever you're joining from, welcome to this webinar and online launch of the latest deep dive paper that we have, which is titled Africa's Just Transition Opportunity, Decolonizing Economic Transformation for Climate Resilience. It is jointly organized by the Earth4All initiative, the Materials and Consumptions Task Force of the Club of Rome, and Power Shift Africa. Today, of course, we're discussing with the two authors, co-authors of the deep dive, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub and Mohamed Amos. Thank you again for joining. I'm not going to say too much about the subject of today's discussion, especially as we have two experienced persons here who can speak more eloquently about it than me. So allow me to say this, however. Africa as a continent and sub-Saharan Africa as a region especially is one of the last few places that is openly subjected to stereotypes of corruption and dependence on foreign aid, while also somewhat ironically acknowledged for the most youthful population and an abundance of natural resources. This dichotomy, as we know, is on collision course as a few things are happening. One, the continent readies itself to bear the brunt of climate change despite contributing very little to the problem. As the continent itself finds itself at the center of global resource conflicts and the pressure to export its natural resources, even when African countries need these resources for their own development. As geopolitical shifts are forcing countries in the region to choose sides and to question allies, and as institutional stickiness and multilateral processes coming under strain of legitimacy and representation. And in this regard, I cannot think of any two people more fit to walk us through what the myth is and what the reality is, and how all these fit in the prospects for the continents in this new era of development defined by climate change, resource conflicts, geopolitical shifts, and questions of institutional stickiness. If you've not yet read the paper on which the discussion is based, it is available online and is titled Africa's Just Transition Opportunity, Decolonizing Economic Transformation for Climate Resilience. Go either to the Earth4All website or to the Club of Rome website. Today, we'll talk development, climate finance, resource flows, energy and food sovereignty, a Pan-African industrial policy, and many more. Just to give a sense of the structure of what it would look like, we'll start with an opening statement from each of the co-authors for 5 minutes, and then I'll ask maybe one or two clarification questions. After that, I'll have a discussion, I'll moderate a discussion between the two co-authors, and then we'll, of course, have questions and answers from participants. So if you have a question, please get ready and submit it in the chat. We have the very wonderful colleagues behind the scenes who will be helping us to pick some of the questions so we can ask. I will start for an opening statement with someone who needs very little introduction, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, who is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He was recently the Undersecretary General for Financing for Development at the Organization for Southern Cooperation in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, of course. And in 2025, Dr. Kaboub was recognized by the New African magazine in the top 100 most influential Africans under the Thinkers and Opinion Shapers category. Fadhel, I'm going to start with you to give us a broad framing and what you perceive as a statement that can sort of pull together what we will be discussing in much detail later on. Over to you.
Thank you, Luis, for hosting this conversation, and thank you again to the Club of Rome and Earth4All for convening this research project. I should start by saying that the initial inception for this idea to produce this report was to bring together two research projects that emerged sort of independently, but moved in the same direction, looking at structural transformation in the context of climate change, in the context of economic transformation, in particular in the African continent. The first research strand comes from the Club of Rome with the publication of the Earth4All book, which our listeners and viewers can see the link maybe in the chat and can find it on the Club of Rome page, which has been translated now in so many languages. I lost track of how many languages. But the Earth4All book was one part of this research project. The second piece is the Just Transition report, which was published by the Independent Expert Group on Just Transition and Development, which was convened by Dr. Yuba Sukona of Mali, who was at the time one of the vice chairs of the IPCC. And I had the opportunity to be part of that research team that produced the Just Transition report. And then the SDGs for All Africa report, also produced by Earth4All and the Club of Rome team. All of these three publications essentially speak slightly different language and terminology, but focusing on the same issues of structural transformation. Essentially, the message is very clear, and I summarize it in my own words by saying we cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And what I mean by that is that the economic system within which we operate today has never been designed for a just transition. In fact, was never designed for democracy or justice or development or human rights or any of the sustainable development goals, because the economic system within which we operate is a colonial economic system. And colonialism, as you know, was designed for extractivism. It was non-democratic, hierarchical, violent, abusive, and you know the rest of the adjectives. But it actually assigned a particular role, economic role, for the African continent that can be summarized in three basic points. And that's where the structural transformation must take place. And that's where the Just Transition report highlights, and that's what the Earth4All framework also highlights. This is where we coincide in terms of structural transformation. So three basic roles imposed on the African continent during colonial times, and these roles persist to this day. Number one, Africa was supposed to be the producer of cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. Number two, Africa is supposed to be the consumer, not the producer, the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, Africa is supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label or the guise of development and cooperation and job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it locks us permanently at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And we still play that role to this day. So, a framework of colonial economic architecture is not conducive to a just transition. So, in order for us to unleash the potential for a just transition, we have to undo these colonial functions, which means the African continent needs to move up the value chain with green industrial transformation. And that's why we highlight the importance of Pan-African green industrialization, which we'll come back to in the conversation. No system can function properly without food, without energy. And Africa's potential is in renewable energy, which is our biggest potential. And that's coincidentally an economic transformation, but it's also a climate adaptation solution. And finally, one of the major structural traps that we identify both in the Just Transition report and the Earth4All research is a transformation of the food system, agricultural sovereignty, agroecology, and food sovereignty. as a major lever of transformation because that's actually a solution to the debt problem. It coincidentally happens to be an economic transformation. It happens to be a climate adaptation solution. So this is kind of the entry point where we have the common denominator for all of these three major publications that we try to kind of synthesize in this report and reinforce the message that no decarbonization, no just transition can happen without economic transformation, and economic transformation of the kind that removes the colonial structures that lock the African continent in the way that I described today. So that's in a way of opening the conversation, and we can talk about some of the details.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. Quite a lot in there to take, and there's quite much detail in the paper. But I'm going to try to let's see. Some people would argue and have indeed argued that it's been several decades since the end of colonization, and that a lot of Africa's problems are somewhere around corruption and the dependence on foreign aid. So, how much would you say Africa's condition today is self-inflicted, and how much of it is imposed?
So I'll start with the following statement. You can cleanse the entire system of corruption, but if you don't remove the structural constraints that I described in terms of locking the African economic system in the same colonial system, we'll still have the same problems. So, of course, it doesn't mean that corruption is okay. Of course, it's not okay. But corruption to me is actually exacerbated by these colonial lock-in mechanisms that produce the external debt trap, that reproduce the colonial functions of extractivism, of rent seeking, of underdevelopment, because this is a model of development of underdevelopment, as some of the economists of the 1960s and 70s described it, because they saw it as soon as we emerged out of the colonial period, they saw that there was some unfinished business. And they started talking about decolonizing economic structures, not just decolonizing the territories and decolonizing the political system. So this is really the unfinished business of our grandparents' generation, is to undo the colonial structures in the economy. And with that, you tackle the corruption, you tackle the inefficiencies that colonial structures were designed to produce.
Thank you so much, Father. In the paper, you write somewhere that Africa is paying more in debt service in one single year than all the climate finance pledges combined, including the 100 million billion from Copenhagen, the Green Climate Fund, and the Loss and Damage Fund. More than half of African countries spend more on debt service than on healthcare and or education.
Mhm.
I will move to our second to the co-author Amos Wemanya, who leads the just transition the just transition aspects of Power Shift Africa's research, advocacy, and communication. Amos is responsible for developing, integrating, and implementing a broad range of strategic initiatives that advance just energy transition to 100% renewable energy and climate justice in Africa. Amos, with this experience and background, can you give us an opening statement to give a broad framing of what you will be discussing later? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lewis and Earth4All for organizing this and for having me. Just a quick clarification is that I did not co-author this paper with Fadhel, but Fadhel co-authored it with Mohamed Ado, who is the director Power Shift Africa. And Mohamed was not able to join us in this conversation. And since I had the chance to review the paper, I will be speaking in that capacity. But just to say that this paper is coming out at a defining moment, especially for Africa, not just in terms of climate action, but as Fadhel has mentioned, for Africa's economic future. Defining moment because, as we all know, the global transition is accelerating, and Africa has been positioned at the center of this transition. But the key question we must ask ourselves, will Africa benefit from this transition or simply fuel it for others? Africa's just transition is not just a climate priority. Of course, the global acceleration of the transition is happening in the context of climate change, and we need to transition systems to be able to address the challenges of climate change. But for Africa, it is a once-in-a-generation development opportunity. An opportunity to industrialize our continent, to achieve energy access to hundreds of millions of Africans that still do not have access to energy, to achieve resilient food systems. In short, it is an opportunity to transform our economies. But this opportunity, we must remember that it is not guaranteed. Because alongside the interventions that we are seeing and the solutions that we are seeing, and this has been clearly captured in the paper, we are also seeing a rise of what I would call distractions. There is interventions that appear as climate action solutions. In reality, these interventions are just risking reinforcing the very structures that Fadhel has spoken to, that have historically held Africa back. So these interventions, for example, carbon market schemes, they are shifting burden onto African communities and African countries, prioritizing other interests. And if we are not careful, Africa could once again find itself at the center of a global transition, but at the bottom of its value chains. So we see some of these initiatives presented as an opportunity to attract climate finance or a way to contribute to global emission reductions. But like I mentioned, we need to look at them more closely because carbon credits, in many cases, and I like the term Fadhel loves to use, they are pollution permits, pollution slips that allow high-emitting countries and corporations to continue emitting and does not help reduce or cut global emissions in any meaningful way. Actually, what they do is they only shift responsibility to African communities and countries. So more importantly, carbon offsetting is actually risking land grabs. We have seen this happen in many communities. In Africa, in Kenya, in Tanzania, we have had the Ogiek, the Maasai, the indigenous communities being displaced, sometimes violently, evicted from the lands that they have depended on, the lands that support the food systems and their livelihoods. So we need to be aware that the benefits that will come with the transition are not guaranteed. And some of the solutions, we need to really interrogate them that are presented to us. Because, like Fadhel mentioned, Africa's transition opportunities is in building industries and not selling offsets. We are also seeing similar things and dynamics emerging with a push for green hydrogen, for example. On the surface, it offers the promise of a clean energy source and Africa helping the world decarbonize. But when we look at the current models, they raise critical questions. Many of these projects are being designed primarily for export to meet energy demand elsewhere. And we're speaking about a continent that has a huge population that do not have access to electricity. So once again, Africa risks playing a familiar role, the one that Fadhel calls supplying raw materials and resources, while value addition, manufacturing, and profits remain elsewhere. We have a name for this. This is actually green extractivism, a model where energy transition becomes a new frontier for the same old patterns of extraction. So we must ask, how can we justify, for example, exporting green energy while millions at home remain energy poor? Another critical element is about food systems. And the paper really speaks to this. Africa currently imports the majority of its food. A legacy of historical policies that have prioritized export crops over local production of food crops that are servicing our needs for foodstuff. This dependence creates vulnerability, it drives debt, and undermines our resilience. So what does a really just transition look like? A just transition that is real, it means shifting from extractivism to a transformation. And it means using Africa's vast potentials in renewable energy, in arable land, youthful population, to power local industries, expand energy access, and support inclusive prosperity. It means investing in practices such as agroecology and local food systems to ensure that Africa can feed itself sustainably. The just transition is our opportunity to change what we have experienced before, the extractive systems, to move beyond extraction, to reject false solutions, and build a future where Africa leads on its own terms. Fadhel will tell you that. So I agree, this paper has come at the right time, and it points to solutions as well as some of these risks that the continent is facing, especially on false solutions and distractions. We have to be careful. We have to build a system that services the interests of our people, that services the needs of Africa, both to develop but also to build resilience to shocks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My apologies for misidentifying you as one of the co-authors, but clearly you embody the message in the paper so deeply. And thank you so much for the eloquence around the issues here. I'm going to benefit a little bit from your background on the just energy transition to 100% renewable energy to ask something that is in the paper. It describes an energy deficit in Africa that the biggest oil exporters, such as Angola and Nigeria, are ironically importing 80% of their fossil fuel from international markets. So, and according to the paper, Africa has always been denied access to technology for developing these energy assets themselves. How is it that a country that produces more oil than it needs still has to import oil? And how are they denied access to technology, and by whom? Just to understand some of the mechanisms at play here.
Yeah, the thing is, who owns Africa's energy? That's the question we need to be asking. At the moment, the fossil fuel dependent energy system is not owned by Africans, it's owned by others. And that's why when you see even the infrastructure, when it's being developed, you get much of the infrastructure is pipelines. And when African leaders and countries ask for refineries, they are told, wait, that will come later. And that's why you see even Nigeria is when now they are building their refinery after exporting their oil resources for decades. So the thing is, energy system that is built on fossil fuels was never meant to service Africa's needs. It was meant to power industries elsewhere. And we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to leverage renewables. But if we develop renewable energy system based on these old models, it will still not service our needs. And that's why, like Fadhel mentions and in the paper, we have to shift the system. We can talk the much, if we are not shifting a system and designing new systems that service our needs, we will still have countries that produce and have huge potential of energy resources still depending on imports. Why would it? There's no explanation for a country that is rich in oil, exporting it in crude form and having to import it refined. Why not just build a refinery and use these resources to power local industries? That is where the hook is. The thing is, this energy system, it demonstrates clearly that was never built to service the needs of Africa. And that's why there's a need for systems change. These cosmetic changes won't service our needs. In this transition, for it to be just, we need to have radical surgery. We need to have a radical shift in the way we are designing the new models.
Thank you so much. I'm going to frame a similar question to Fadhel because I know he's talked a lot about this, especially in light that Africa only attracts less than 2% of global renewable energy financing. But according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040 with currently existing renewable technologies and can completely replace all the continent's fossil fuel exports. Fadhel, what would it take to realize this? And you talk a lot, while I'm at it, you talk a lot about the problem with current climate energy finance, climate and energy finance. If you could include that in your response, that would be very helpful.
Absolutely. The numbers are actually getting worse. It's no longer 2% of global financing coming to Africa. It's now 1% of global financing for renewables coming to Africa. So just like the old energy system where we've been denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, to refine oil, similarly now in the new energy system, we're being denied access to financing, but also access to the manufacturing technology to use our own critical minerals to manufacture and deploy the renewables that will give us this massive potential to become a global energy powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse, and as a result, an economic and geopolitical powerhouse. And it's precisely because of that potential that the African continent is being perceived as a potential threat to the existing economic and geopolitical hierarchies. And when you perceive a threat, you deal with it accordingly, which means you try to eliminate the threat, you try to minimize the risks of that threat. And that's why we see these structural constraints in terms of transfer of technology. If we're in the middle of a climate crisis, right? And the solution to this climate crisis is unleashing massive renewable energy investments, which the African continent can do. And the technology for unleashing this potential is available everywhere in Europe and the US and Japan and China. Why is the transfer of technology being denied? And why is the financing for renewables for the continent that has the biggest potential for renewables is still not coming? It's precisely because the economic transformation that will be unleashed represents a threat to the existing economic and geopolitical hierarchy. That is the simple answer. And that's why after COP29, which was supposed to be the climate finance COP, right? When we went to COP29 in the global South and Africa were asking for transformative climate finance, the kind we talk about in the paper that will actually unleash the economic transformation. Not any kind of climate finance, kind of the tranquilizing drugs of the climate negotiations, so to speak. What we ended up seeing at the end of COP29 was that COP29 was actually not about climate finance at the end of the day. It was not even about climate. It was about an economic and geopolitical hierarchy that refuses to be disrupted. Because if we had even a small amount of transformative climate finance in the form of transfer of technology, in the form of grants, not loans and economic entrapment, in the form of debt cancellation, not as charity, because here we're talking about a continent that has cumulative emissions of about 4% of global emissions. That's the equivalent of Spain alone. The state of Texas alone emits double the emissions of the African continent, right? Which means, in terms of carbon budget, the African continent and the rest of the global South is owed a climate debt because we haven't exhausted our climate budget. So when you deal with the concept of debt, if you're a lawyer, if you're an economist, if you're a financier, the concept of debt is very straightforward. If I owe you $100, Louis, I'm supposed to pay you $100 and you're not supposed to give me anything, right? That's how debt is paid. But in the climate finance space, instead of me giving you $100, instead of that, I give you $2.50, and I tell you exactly what to do with it. And I dictate conditionalities on you, and I threaten to withhold the payments if you don't do as I say. And then I feel bad for you because you clearly need more than $2.50 for climate finance. So I'm going to lend you $10 with interest, of course. And I tell you exactly what to do with the $10. And I set up economic entrapment for you and set you up for a debt trap. And then, of course, I need to give you more because we're in the middle of a climate crisis. So I'm going to give you another $15, but you have to give me your forest to offset my emissions. Those are the pollution permits we were talking about earlier. And that's called climate finance, right? And then I'm gonna have my companies invest another $20 in your country to produce green hydrogen for me, not for you, using your water and your sun and your resources and your labor, displacing your indigenous communities from their own lands. So I can have, and you have to de-risk the investment for me to guarantee my profitability. And I call that climate finance and cooperation and partnership. And you're looking at me and saying, wait a minute, where's my $100? Why am I giving you my land, my forest? Why am I paying interest on this? Is supposed to be a debt to be paid, right? So we need to reset the conversation about climate finance from an African perspective, where we don't go into these climate negotiations begging for crumbs and accepting debt traps as part of a conversation that should be about climate reparations, transfer of technology, real structural transformation that can produce a win-win scenario. If we're serious about climate change, then Africa has the keys for the climate solutions. And what we need is transfer of technology, financing that is transformative. And we're not asking for any special favors. This is the kind of development finance, because this is development finance. It's not just climate finance. This is the kind of development finance that was provided to some countries that were handpicked for geopolitical reasons in the past. Let me give you one example. Germany after World War II. The very first 3 or 4 years after the war, Germany was supposed to become a backwards nation, an agrarian society, never to rise again, right? Never to industrialize again. Until the Marshall Plan came into being. The Marshall Plan said, no, Germany needs to become an industrial powerhouse to withstand the Soviet threat. So, what was the formula for Germany under the Marshall Plan? The Marshall Plan was an industrialization policy with transfer of technology, with privileged access to global markets, with financing that was commensurate with Western Germany at the time, their capacity to actually pay back some of the financing that was loan-based, not grant-based. And it was coupled by debt cancellation. This is something that people forget, that in 1955, the world canceled 50% of Germany's external debt. No African country today can dream of a 50% debt cancellation. Even climate debt cancellation is not even on the table. Talk to the Paris Club, talk to the London Club, talk to the IMF. They will not even consider a 50% debt cancellation. So we have a formula that works. Cancel 50% of the debt, transfer technology, and give privileged access to market for real industrial policy with financing that doesn't set you up for a debt trap. And you'll have an industrial powerhouse, just like you had Germany, just like you had Japan after the war, just like you had Singapore and South Korea and Israel. There was a few countries that were given a privileged formula for actual development and industrialization. We're asking for reciprocal treatment in the context of the climate crisis. And that is why I always say this is not about climate finance. This is not about climate change. This is about economic development, structural transformation, about an economic potential that is waiting to be unleashed, but is structurally constrained with the development finance framework that we're talking about today.
Thank you so much for that. I don't know what to be more scared of, that you're so eloquent with this issue or the rot that you expose at the very heart of our negotiation processes. I will come back to you on how we deal with these issues because I know there's a part of the paper that covers this at length. But first, I should go back to Amos because as well as energy, there's the issue of food security in the paper. I know, Amos, that you happen to be quite familiar with this. And the the paper says Africa must reject the so-called food security approach to deal with hunger and instead adopt a more sustainable agroecology approach aimed at restoring food sovereignty at a national, regional, and Pan-African levels. Could you elaborate on this contrast between a food security approach and a sustainable agroecology approach and why this is so important to Africa at this juncture?
Yes, like I mentioned, the challenge started with the movement from growing food crops that service the nutritional needs of the population on the continent to focusing on cash crops. And what this model has done is has created an element of food deficit on the continent. And to service this deficit, what is also being proposed is food imports and food aid relief because we need land for cash crops and not food crops. So what energy sovereignty, food sovereignty means is having to grow our own food using our local resources, connecting producers to consumers, being able to utilize the resources that we have to be able to produce food that services our needs and not growing food for the market. And there is models that have worked for the continent, models that utilize local knowledge, practices that empowers farmers, specifically smallholder farmers, that have fed the continent for ages. You see the introduction of cash crops and growing crops for industrial and market disempowers farmers because what it does is it promotes large-scale use of chemicals and synthetic fertilizers, but also monoculture that simplifies ecosystems that these farmers have depended on for a very long time. The paper promotes agroecology, and we've been working with farmers to promote agroecology because it empowers farmers to use systems, but also enriches biodiversity and ecosystems that are very important. It reduces reliance on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, but also chemical use. And this helps farmers to reduce input costs, which leaves them with a room for resources to be deployed in other activities. But with a focus on industrial agriculture that is chemical heavy, you realize that farmers have to spend a lot of resources on inputs. And these inputs are actually not locally owned. They are developed by multinational corporations. So they are just profiting these multinational corporations at the expense of the farmers. And this is what puts even farmers in debt. They are not able to continue producing for even themselves. And the solution that is presented to them is grow crops that you can sell, coffee, tea, sugarcane, that they have to depend on the industry that they don't have control over for their farming. We have farmers here who grow coffee here in Kenya, and they cannot even afford a cup of coffee themselves. They don't even take coffee. So what Fadhel normally says, we grow what we don't eat and eat what we don't grow. So we have to import the foodstuffs. So that's the difference. A new system has to be a system that empowers farmers to be able to use available resources within their localities to produce for their own needs. The one that connects producers and consumers, the one that creates a community around our food systems, the one that creates food systems that are ecosystem-based, that protect our ecosystems, not the one that drain resources from our systems to others.
Thank you. Fadhel, I know you have something to add here, but I'm going to stay with this for a little bit, partly because I think it's very important, but also partly because the question is asked by my sensei and mentor, and I cannot not ask this question. The relationship between a prof and a student. It's Arthur Dahl. Author is asking, colonialism today is driven by corporations without any global governance, unlike national governments. How can Africa overcome this? You can use this, you can elaborate on this in terms of energy or food as you find more suitable. Essentially, we have democratically elected governments that are taking a backseat and corporations, some of them bigger than national governments, that are running around the world and determining rules of engagement. Amos, if you want to go first, or Fadhel.
I think Fadhel, you are already unmuted. Do you want to go?
I'm happy to take this.
Fadhel, you go first, please.
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, take the case of Nigeria, since we talked about the fossil fuel industry in Nigeria. Of course, the Nigerian oil industry was dominated by foreign corporations, and when Dangote, the Nigerian billionaire, decided to enter the sector, and he's never been in the fossil fuel industry. He made his billions in other industries. They let him spend $20 billion of his own money building the refinery. And when the day came for him to open the refinery, he needed crude oil, and he couldn't get a single drop of oil from Nigeria because Nigeria's oil was already spoken for. It was already for global markets. It was already taken by the big four or the big five. And there was nothing that the Nigerian government could do because these are, contracts signed, sealed, and delivered. Of course, there's corruption involved, there's other issues, but, they wanted to drive him into bankruptcy. He had to import oil at a premium, paying for it in dollars from Brazil, from Libya, from other suppliers, until eventually they negotiated, some amount of some quantity of oil to be provided. So there are some serious issues there with the unchecked power of multinational corporations. Even worse than that, we talk about it in this paper and a lot of the research that we produced over the last few years, which is ISDS treaties, investor state dispute systems, where corporations can sue states, back to the Stone Ages, or at least threaten to sue states back to the Stone Age if they dare to change domestic regulations that would threaten in any way their profitability. And that includes fossil fuel companies. So if a fossil fuel company is benefiting from an ISDS treaty, and then a government decides to invest in renewables and start phasing out fossil fuels, it's effectively taking away their profits. So they get sued by a fossil fuel company saying, "How dare you take away my profits because we have an ISDS treaty?" So all of these things need to go away. This is the unchecked power of multinational corporations. Some of it is domestic corporations that need to come under very aggressive antitrust regulations, and some of it has to be done under international treaties to undo some of the damage that WTO rules have put in place over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. Amos.
I think Fadhel has exhaustively addressed that. Les, thanks.
All right. I would like to move a bit towards solutions here, in addition to some of those that have come up. There's a part of the paper that goes very eloquently into a Pan-African industrial policy. It argues that real transformative industrialization cannot happen at a national level because most countries in the continent lack the requisite economies of scale. It calls for Pan-African industrial policies. What would such a Pan-African industrial strategy look like, or policies look like, and how would it work, Fadhel?
So real industrialization, requires economies of scale. And no African country has enough of an internal market size to industrialize alone. And if you try to industrialize alone, which is basically what every African country has been trying to do since independence, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. So you end up locked at the bottom of the value chain. Now, the advantage of Pan-African joint industrial policies, or at least regional industrial policies, think of the SADC region, think of the ECOWAS region, or think of the continent as a whole. We're the size of China, except potentially richer in resources and potential. We have the complementarity of resources and capabilities, which is important. We have the economies of scale because we're a large continent. We have the youngest labor force on the planet. The median age is 19.5 in Africa. What is missing is a political recognition at the highest level, meaning heads of state, that says we need to coordinate joint industrial policies. Because even ministers of industries don't have the political portfolio to coordinate. Their mandate is to work at the national level. So it has to be heads of states that have cabinet level conversations about joint industrial policies. And you can start with the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. You can start with joint procurement plans because we all buy the same stuff from the same global corporations. So if you bundle up your procurements, you can at least get a discount and save a significant amount of foreign exchange expenditures from the things you import. And then you can gather data about all the things that we collectively import and start identifying import substitution industrialization, where you recognize we all buy this stuff, so we have enough economies of scale, we have all the raw materials, we have the technical capabilities, and you start identifying ways where you can build an entire value chain across a network of countries where you build towards replicating an entire value chain. You may not be able to replicate it in 1 or 2 years, but over a 30-year period, you can replicate an entire value chain, or at least the majority of the value chain. And in areas where the technology is way out of your reach, this is where you go in with the collective weight of an economic bloc and bargain for joint ventures for in-kind contribution by major economic blocs that have the technology that you want to use. So you don't have to go asking for loans and debt traps. You ask for joint ventures with in-kind contribution, with bargaining for market access, bargaining for economic and geopolitical weight that you have as a bloc rather than as individual nations. So this is kind of the starting point for Pan-African industrialization. And that's why I always say, I don't use the term Pan-Africanism as kind of the nice, fluffy, rhetorical term, which is nice. Of course, we like Pan-Africanism as a symbol of solidarity and expression of brotherhood and sisterhood and all of that. That's fine. But I use it in the technical sense of the term. That is, Pan-Africanism is the economics of industrialization. Pan-Africanism is the economics of prosperity. And I even dare say that it's Pan-Africanism or death, because all the breakdown of all the life-sustaining systems, that is the food system, the water, the biodiversity, the energy system, the health, the breakdown of all of these life-sustaining systems is actually exacerbated by the climate crisis, by the dangerous distractions, by the neo-colonial greenwashing distractions that we see, by the economic entrapment that we see. So it's either structural transformation via Pan-African joint industrial policies, agricultural policies, and the structural transformation we talk about in this report, or it's death because the life-sustaining systems will not survive with the exacerbation that we're continuing to see unfold day after day, year after year.
Thank you, Father. I'll come back to you for one last question because you talk about a grand bargain, and I would quite love to hear about it. But before that, I want to go to Amos. There's a question from one of the participants, and it's quite apt because one of the things in the paper, it talks about the need to reject false solutions, what it characterizes as false solutions. And one of those is current carbon markets. And so someone is asking, does it mean mechanisms like carbon markets are generally bad models of climate financing, especially for land-based projects on community and indigenous peoples' lands, or should they be designed differently to complement other efforts, and how? Given your background, Amos, I'd like to ask what you see, considering that you've described, you've agreed with the characterization that carbon markets are a false solution. What do you see as alternatives, viable alternatives here?
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. The thing is, the African climate story actually did not begin in 1992 with the Rio Conventions. It began with when we had especially the global north appropriating and colonizing atmospheric commons, industrializing and benefiting from that, but also from Africa's blood and sweat through slavery. And the framing around climate debt is a great framing. But you find that when we are negotiating to address these challenges that are presented by these injustices, the element that comes is further structural conversations that continue to limit Africa's prosperity and unlocking Africa's potential. So the element of climate reparations should be the focus of these conversations. But you find schemes such as carbon credits and carbon market schemes being fronted as solutions to unlocking climate finance. When we know that actually carbon market schemes are not fit for purpose, one, to reduce emissions or cut emissions. They are just delay tactics that shifts responsibility. You cannot equate carbon removal to emissions reductions. What these schemes do, they want to equate fossil fuel emissions with biological storage that is temporary and not permanent, with permanent emissions that are caused from burning fossils. So this does not service the need for us to cut emissions and save the communities that are already facing the impacts from further impacts. It promises finance that are going to help communities build resilience and develop, but it does not offer that. What it does, it offers money to brokers and intermediaries at the expense of communities losing their land and being thrown crumbs at them that do not help them very much. What is needed is to make polluters pay. And there are mechanisms that have already started, like the UN Tax Convention discussions. Those are very important discussions because one, they are conversations that are going to unlock resources on the continent and make polluters, those that have contributed to this pollution and the injustices, to pay for it. We need to stop illicit financial flows from the continent. When you look at the resources that are bled from our continent, that we bleed, versus what comes back, you realize that we just need to stop the taps. And we have enough resources for community to be able to prosper, to be able to build this resilience. There is need for a UN debt convention. These conversations are happening, and there is need for that. Like Fadhel mentioned, we have seen previously debt cancellations in such situations. Why not now, when we have a climate crisis that is not just an ecological crisis, but it's a socioeconomic crisis? And that's why framing is very important. The climate debt that is owed to Africa is not just about the impacts of the climate crisis, but it dates back to the injustices. So the solutions that are presented have to repair these injustices.
Thank you so much for this. There's quite a lot to unpack in what you've said, and I wish we had a lot more time. But I have one last question before we go, because I know, Fadhel, you're working on something you've described as the geopolitical bargain of the century, pretty much linked to the prospects of Africa and its development this century. Can you give us a teaser of what that is and how it ties to some of the questions that we've explored in this conversation today?
Imagine for a second we have, let's say, 20 African countries with political leaders at the highest level who understand the conversation we just had, that we need to have joint industrial policies. Imagine that we've pre-negotiated internally within that bloc the terms of the ownership structure of this joint industrial policy, the distribution of the wage and profit share, the terms of extractivism with protection of labor rights and human rights and frontline communities and biodiversity rights. Imagine we've done all of our homework internally to co-create and co-design an industrial strategy that doesn't reproduce the injustice and inequities of the existing system. We have the resources, the capabilities, the economies of scale. We're looking for a technological partner, not to give us a loan, but to give us in-kind technology transfer and partnership for this economic transformation. Imagine for a second that we go to a country like China that has the technology that we want. And I'll explain why China in particular. Imagine we go to China and say, look, we give you the bargain of the century. If you agree to these terms, to share your technology on our terms, here's what we give you in return. Here's what you get in return. In 10 to 15 years, you can double your industrial footprint globally. You double your geopolitical weight globally. You have privileged access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. And we give you privileged access to the largest market on the planet. By the end of the century, the African continent will be a market of 4 billion consumers. Long story short, after a little bit of negotiation back and forth, China will basically agree to these terms because it's not really a threat to its position globally. It's not a challenge for China. It's a win-win. The idea here is not to position China at the top of the economic hierarchy globally, but rather to trigger a process that will give us a second bargaining chip that we can then take to other major countries in the global north and say, look, we give you the same bargain we just gave to China. If you share your technology to manufacture and deploy on our terms, high-speed rail technology, pharmaceutical technology, wind turbine technology, geothermal technology, whatever building blocks of development and prosperity, technological transfer that we need, we start bargaining to bring in the building blocks that we need on our terms, not on neo-colonial terms, not on debt trap terms. And countries that refuse to participate at that point, they basically identify themselves as the isolated global minority because we, Africa and the rest of the global south, we become the global majority. We are the majority of the world. And this is a process by which we reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order, of a true multipolar system of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And in that process, we rewrite the rules of international trade, finance, investment, and taxation. This is the new international economic order that 50 years ago, right after the era of independence, political independence, all the major diplomats and scholars and thinkers were talking about we need to rewrite the rules of the international system. This is the structural decolonization that we need on a global scale.
Thank you so much. I wish we had several more hours to explore these issues. What is becoming really clear is that old systems of governance, as we know them, can no longer serve the larger questions, the big ticket issues that we have nowadays. And that countries that used to see themselves as small and a minority country are asking for a seat on the table on equal terms. That the nature of relationships between the global north and the global south has to change. The questions around sovereignty and global commons need to be examined a little bit more critically. And justice, this question of justice will not disappear. Not only because, not if we keep tiptoeing around it, and especially not if we refuse to put it at the center of the discussions we're having going forward. In a heavily contested century around resources, around climate change, around geopolitics, around technology, I think we have almost no choice. And I am so thankful to the two of you for having so eloquently elaborated on this. We do this a lot at the Earth4All initiative, at the Club of Rome, and at the Hot or Cool Institute. I'm happy that we could partner with Power Shift Africa. To all our participants, thank you so much for attending. And to Fadhel and Amos, thank you so very much. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you.
Can you just stay on for a bit? I think